So as we ponder the emergence of the latest scandal involving the Mar-a-Lago fraudster, we notice that when it happened about a week ago, we were on the full moon cutting across Leo Aquarius, but more importantly, pretty much precisely on the midpoint of his rising Pluto-Mars, so in the 18.5 degree range. And you notice that whereas Saturn is fairly nearby, you see it over here. We go back to August, it's in the 22 degree range, 22, 21. But the planet that was most precise in hitting those degrees, the 18, 19 degree range, is actually Uranus in here. Now that would correlate with the unexpected and shocking nature of the event, both for the populace, as in us, hearing about it, but also, I'm quite sure, for Trump himself, who probably assumed that such a thing would never happen, but in fact it did. And this is where one of the things you would say would be that the Uranus in his chart being in, first of all, in Gemini, which is a records sign, about 5 degrees from his sun, which puts it in what is known as combust, and therefore weakens it and makes it a problematic planet, both in the way he expresses it, as in excessive individuality, excessive rebellion. This man is almost like a teenager. But then a planet like this in transit becomes problematic, particularly when it's making challenging aspects like this. Now you have to notice that it's here in these degrees as this is happening, but then it backtracks away from those degrees, and then it finds those degrees again well into 2023. And indeed, I've made a note here, in early 24, it's still at 19 degrees. So this is a long-term transit of these degrees, therefore telling you there's a lot of runway for this problem to continue to gain momentum, or for that matter, at any point along the way, to explode in his face. And to make matters worse, even though Saturn, as it is happening, was not at those degrees, it's a little forward, it's in the early 20s. Well, first of all, if you backtrack enough to earlier in the year, it has been at those degrees. And it's a pretty basic astrology 101 rule. When a planet has crossed certain degrees, it operates out of those degrees, whether or not it's there as it makes its way forward, particularly when you can see that going into October, into the election period, it's actually going to make a station at those degrees. Indeed, in the period we're in now, Saturn and Uranus are very, very close to an exact square to each other in those very degrees. All of this is very bad news for Trump on this account, because, as I say, the Uranus and Gemini connected to records. If you then dig in to say, well, what rules the Uranus? Mercury. Mercury's in the 12th, very complicated planet, part of a T-square, his infamous Access Hollywood T-square, which always earmarks transits that affect it, he feels, in a negative way. And then if you trace the rulership of Mercury, you would go to the moon in Sagittarius, because the moon rules Cancer. Then Jupiter rules the moon, and then Venus rules Jupiter, and you're back in the 12th. You get a kind of movement between 3 planets that ends up in the 12th house, which is not a good thing. The 12th, as I've said often, is the place of criminality, and that's what this guy is involved in. He's basically being caught in a kind of sting around the gross mismanagement of records, secret records. Indeed, if you go to secrecy, the 12th is one of those houses. The 8th would be the second, the fourth, perhaps the third, certainly the 12th. The 12th is one of the places where you would archive records, for example. It's an institutional house for the government. That's the last thing you need with this kind of transit. So we already noticed too that the whole event connects to the Jupiter station, triggering his Access Hollywood T, because Jupiter was doing exactly that in late July. Station, and it was still there pretty much as this was happening, but even though it backtracks to make another station here in late Pisces, which isn't good for him at all either, from late Pisces, but it'll take another run at those degrees as we go into 2023. And probably more ominous is this Eris at 25 degrees in its station, which happens in late July. And the way Eris operates, it moves glacially slow as it makes its way through Aries. And it's doing this thing where it stations twice a year, once in July, once in January. So you see it at 25 here. It's going to backtrack to station in early January or mid-January at 23, almost 24. And then goes forward, though it's not shown here, to make another station July of 23 at 25 and a bit, just barely above where these degrees are. In other words, this Eris is locked into the Saturn-Venus conjunction, and it's not going to let go. And what's problematic about this is that this is a legal house. So it's one thing to say, well, Jupiter is there when this is happening. Sure, it is, and it correlates with trouble. Jupiter will leave, though. It moves fairly quick. So you'll get into Taurus by the summer of 24. It will no longer be a factor as far as the legal house. But Eris, it's there until 2033, 2034. It never lets up. One of the ways you know that Eris is very active in this guy's chart is that you often see women in the form of either prosecutors or judges involved in basically chasing him down, and this doesn't stop anytime soon. So bottom line, even though many have said that he turned this FBI search warrant immediately into a raid and immediately turned it into a political message, played the victim and so forth, and many have said that it represents or could represent a win for him, I am deeply skeptical about that. I think this is a very serious issue because what he's done is he's actually created tangible evidence against himself. This chart has very strong connections to records. It's ironic that he went after Hillary years ago and now he's facing the same karma himself. The connection to records is via Gemini, because Gemini is the pure sign of records. But then you go to the third sign, which is the sign of Gemini in any house, in any chart, pardon me, and you see the Neptune in there, part of a T-square. You see the Jupiter in there, making squares to the 12th house planets, and Venus, which is in the 12th sign, conjunct Saturn, rules the third sign. So records are all over this chart. And so when you take into account that the amount of runway is so long in this chart, because you see the Uranus going into 24, still part of it. Neptune certainly is no help at all. It's going to station in December of 2022 in direct square to his sun and moon, extremely unhelpful. Even the Pluto, you notice that it'll go into Aquarius in 2023, but it backtracks and gets to about 2750, just under 28 in October of 23. So this Pluto continues to oppose the Venus. This chart is a royal mess in terms of the pressure from all kinds of planets. And to my mind, what he's done here is very reminiscent of what happened to the 20th century gangster Al Capone, who was known to have murdered many, and the government was trying to put him away, but the way they did it was through tax evasion, because it's simpler. You can pin it to paperwork, and therefore makes it easier to convict. And to my mind, this is exactly the same thing that is happening here to the Mar-a-Lago cockroach. So, what can you say? As I often have said in the past, couldn't happen to a nicer guy.